title of my talk today is Can Biologically Sensitive Stress Research Be Used to Optimize Educational Environments? And it's got a question mark at the end of it because we're really in the beginning of a new body of research here and integrating biological markers of stress into educational settings to try to understand if these can be used to help children perform better and also have better health outcomes over the long term. So we'll start with an overview. Not all stress is bad. We'll talk about the different types of stress. We'll talk about individual differences and biological sensitivity to context and the dandelion and orchid theory of individual differences. We'll talk about the stress response system and how stress becomes biologically embedded. We will talk about the effects of stress on learning and memory and health. We'll talk about the schools really as biologically sensitive systems, which is very important. The systems research is showing remarkable data in terms of how things all work together, and thinking about a school as really a system and a biological system is key. So we'll talk about that. And the goal is really to harness this biological data in a manner that can help optimize educational outcomes and learning environments for children, and particularly children living in poverty. So a quick nutshell on stress. It's partly nature and partly nurture. As the definition of stress is a state of mental or emotional strain or tension resulting from adverse or very demanding circumstances. So again, there's that negative connotation of stress. Twin studies show that there are sizable individual differences in the response and reactivity to stress. The heritability is anywhere between 30 and 50%, depending on which study you're looking at. So genetics play a significant role. Nurture is incredibly important too. It's very important with this in this field of behavioral genetics. It's the human nature to ask how much is nature and how much is nurture, but it's really is an integrated relationship throughout the course of the lifespan. So it's really nature and nurture working together. But there are genes that can confer vulnerability to stress, like the 5-HTT serotonin transporter gene, the oxytocin receptor gene, and the DRD4 7 repeat allele. We can talk about any of this in detail later. I can provide additional information, but there are genes associated with the stress response. Generally, effect sizes are very, very small. However, it's important to remember that over a lifespan, a small effect size in the beginning can amount to a larger effect size later on in life. So stress perception and reactivity are mediated by genes, environmental context, and then the gene-environment interactions, this whole field of epigenetics. And there's also evidence on the intergenerational transmission of stress. So it's a fascinating and exploding field, really, as we're understanding the implications. So bottom line, stress is really in the eye of the beholder. So what was perceived by an individual is really the biological reality of what is happening. Again, not all stress is bad. Over 100 years ago, Yerkes and Dodson created the Yerkes-Dodson law, and there's an inverse U-shaped curve of stress and performance. So both low stress and high stress are not good. And there tends to be this sort of bell-shaped curve in the middle of performance. And people need a certain amount of stress to be able to perform at their optimal level. And this depends on the individual, it depends on the context. But there is a proper level of good stress for each person. So going into types of stress, there are three primary types of stress. And a lot of this was conceptualized by Jack Shonkoff and his group at Harvard, who's done tremendous work in this arena. There is positive stress. This is this motivating force of stress on performance and using stress as a positive force. Tolerable stress, which is when stressful external events occur in a child's life but are manageable with nurturing adult support, buffering adult support to really buffer the effects of the stressor and help the child feel safe. So those are tolerable stress. That's tolerable stress. Toxic stress is extraneous shocks to the system environmentally, and this can be abuse, adverse childhood experiences, economic insecurity stemming from poverty that are experienced by the child in the absence of buffering adult support. That is when the biological mediators of stress can have longer term implications that are critical in terms of learning, memory, and health outcomes. So moving on to biological sensitivity to context, all of these various stressors, these categories will be perceived by an individual child in a in a unique manner depending on who they are, their genetics, their life experience, and then how these all work together in their support system around them. But inherently there is a range, as there are in all human behaviors, of response and reactivity to stress. And they're on one end of the spectrum, the dandelion children who can, as you see from the picture here, grow in a crack in a rock. They're very resilient. They can bounce back. They're hardy. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have more orchid types of children who need perfect environmental conditions to really thrive. And so thinking about this range is essential in understanding these individual differences in both susceptibility and resilience to environmental conditions. So moving into the stress response system and how these individual differences are mediated at a biological level. The HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, is one of the primary systems involved in the stress response. And the HPA axis is responsible for emitting cortisol, which is the hormone most associated and most studied as related to stress. And we'll talk about cortisol a little bit later as we discuss our topic today. The autonomic nervous system is also a system. This is the automatic respiration, breathing, cardiovascular function. The automatic nervous system is also highly involved in the stress response. Alpha amylase is a key marker of autonomic nervous system function. And you see cortisol and amylase both measure the stress response, but in different ways. We have inflammatory markers that are released during the stress response, such as cytokines like IL-6 and IL-8. These can be measured through blood, through saliva, through various different manners. And then C-reactive protein is also a inflammatory marker that's highly studied in response to stress in the stress response system. Nerve growth factor is a newer analyte that's being studied in terms of the stress response system, and it's more of a resilience factor in sort of mediating the effects of cortisol. So what we're understanding now as we're getting deeper into the stress response system from a biological standpoint, as we get this coordinated system of different biological markers working together to mediate individual differences in the stress response. These are all important because they affect memory and learning. So in this slide, we have a picture of the brain. And in fMRI studies, what we know is that elevated levels of cortisol over the long term, particularly under conditions of chronic stress, can reshape the functionality of brain structures. So the hippocampus, which is the primary brain structure involved in learning and memory, what we've seen in fMRI studies is it actually shrinks. It becomes smaller. It's like a muscle that shrinks, and so there are performance implications from that as well. Clearly, the prefrontal cortex, the brain structure most highly involved in executive function skills and mediating task performance and regulation and so forth. We see implications for the prefrontal cortex as well, and when the prefrontal cortex is affected, it can't properly regulate the amygdala, which is the brain structure really involved in emotional reactivity and emotional response. And so what we see in fMRI studies is an enlarged amygdala size. So we get the hippocampus, not working properly to integrate the learning and memory. And then we have the amygdala and an overreactive response to stress, this pattern of the stress response that becomes elevated as these connections, these neural connections, are really overwired. In terms of health, which is one topic we don't talk about as much in the educational space, but it's critical because the foundations of health, as we're learning more and more about health and the roots of health, we're really looking to childhood and even prenatally to really understand the foundations of health over the life term. The biological embedding of chronic stress is a research arena that's been going on for decades, but really it's become quite. There's been a great deal of interest more recently around this metric of allostatic load. And in Paul Tufts' book, How Children Succeed, which is a fabulous book, it brought this notion of allostatic load, or the biological embedding of stress, into the educational discussion. And essentially, allostatic load is a concept that gets to the core of how the mind and the body are linked. We know that there's a link between the mind and the body, and how we perceive stress in the world around us, and how it's related to illness and so forth. Allostatic load gets to why this happens, really the underlying mechanisms. The body is designed to deal with stress. We have stress in our lives, all of us do, at different levels. And our body is designed to react and revert to homeostasis, to get back to baseline. This doesn't always happen, and under conditions of chronic stress, you get these entirely dysregulated systems of stress hormones reshaping brain function and health outcomes over the long term. So with the biological embedding of stress and allostatic load, we're also seeing much higher rates of chronic disease over the long term. So it's important to bear that in mind. The physiological toll of chronic stress and this notion of allostatic load pulls in the HPA axis, as we were talking about, which is part of the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, the inflammatory system, cardiovascular system, the metabolic system, and then the respiratory system. And it really pulls in markers from all of these systems to understand how high a person's risk is based on what their numbers look like in these various systems. And one system interacts with another system. So you really got to think about it as a cascade effect. You've got high levels of cortisol affecting another thing, and it takes its toll. You also get behavioral issues of dealing with chronic stress that manifest in not getting enough sleep and not eating proper food and those kinds of things, and that can really exacerbate the whole process and it helps explain the link with chronic disease over the longer term. Stress is endemic in all of our lives in some way, shape, or form, as I've said. And while I've mentioned poverty several times in this conversation, it's important to understand that stress cuts across socioeconomic lines. So there's the chronic stress of poverty and those implications. There is also stress in very high pressure academic environments. And again, in the dandelion orchid conversation, depending on the child, that stress is going to be manifested in different ways. So really, what I want to really convey with this point is that it's important across the board, not just in terms of poverty, although that is where there is a tremendous need and where a great deal of resources need to be focused at this time, but it does cut across socioeconomic lines, and it's important for everybody. Moving on to systems, and we've talked a lot about individual differences now, but let's talk a bit about schools and schools as biological systems. We can apply this sort of notion of systems biology really to school systems as well, not school systems in terms of multiple schools, but thinking about the school as a biological system. As we have had biologically sensitive research come out on social networks, we can really observe underlying dynamics of relationships between people and leadership status and popularity and anxiety, and how these all operate within a system, in a classroom, and within a school. So these are important questions to be following up on and asking, because there is a fair amount of documentation on the contagion effect of stress. And stress can be contagious within groups and within systems, and to the degree that we can understand this dynamic from a multi-level standpoint, it may be helpful in helping us optimize educational environments. So we can think about this at the classroom level and also at the school level. And I think about the healthy schools movement and nutrition and exercise and how important all these things are. And I think stress management is also a key aspect of this, of what a really healthy school is, and understanding stress and ameliorating that in the proper way for children. So in terms of managing stress, we all know the basics, right? It's nutrition, exercise. There's a wonderful book by John Rady out called Spark, and it's on the neurobiology of exercise. It's good for health, behavior, attention. It oxygenates the brain cells. spurs neurogenesis. It's all good. So that's very helpful, and this is particularly important as playground recess time is being cut back on in many schools. It is important for children to get out and move. Critical. Social support is very important for stress, as is sleep. There's a lot of research on sleep coming out showing how important that is in terms of healing the body and the mind at night. Can stress be an ally? So back to the positive reframing of stress. Again, perception drives reality. There are ways to inoculate children and adults too against stress, and we can think more about how to develop those types of interventions when we understand more about individual differences and how the biology of classrooms and schools work. I think about this in both high poverty settings in terms of helping children manage their own behavior or manage a situation that becomes complicated by finding a way to center themselves. There has been some new cutting-edge research on mindfulness meditation and what it does to children's cortisol levels and their ability to pay attention and learn in the classroom. So these are just tools that we can own, that are available to us in the moment, but teaching children skills where they can manage themselves under stressful conditions is I think a wise and important intervention course to consider as we move forward. There's also stress inoculation in terms of working with high pressure, high performance children and with test anxiety and understanding those dynamics so that we can better help them perform, but also I really think about the long-term health implications of holding all of this stress. So health is a key outcome as well that we're very interested in. So reappraising anxiety as excitement is one possibility. Thinking about stress as, okay, there's my heart is pounding, okay, it's time to really kick into high gear. So kind of reshaping thoughts about what stress is and empowering children with tools to manage that stress. We saw the Yerkes-Dodson curve earlier on. Another way to look at it, and one method that we're very interested in, is looking at a three-way model where we have the performance and we have the cognitive anxiety, so the cognitive and the performance, just like Yerkes-Dodson, but then modeling in the physiological as well to try to understand at what point the choke response sets in, to try to understand, at what point the behavior really shifts from being perfectly fine and on a good trajectory to in a negative trajectory. So trying to understand these underlying dynamics by way of understanding the underlying biology in the context of the situation. So in conclusion, not all stress is bad. We talked about the types of stress. We talked about orchids and dandelion children. And we talked about the stress response system and its biological embedding, the effects on learning, memory, and health, and schools as biologically sensitive systems. And the ultimate goal, and hopefully we will have a new crop of researchers who will look to explore educational research through a different prism in the future, integrating in non-invasive measures of biology to really understand in a way that we've never been able to understand before individual differences in performance, how systems operate, and really harness this data in order to optimize outcomes for all children. Thank you very much.